Hello everyone, my name is Callender, and I'm presuming I'm the only undertaker to appear on any breaking conventional panel this conference, though I'm willing to be corrected. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? One for the kids there. I'm really very grateful to the organisers for inviting me to speak on this high-minded panel. I've only been to Breaking Convention once, the first one, and it was a memorable experience. Not just because I came with the one-woman hurricane who is here, that is Professor Sue Blackmore, who is herself a potent psychedelic, or because I ended up sharing spliffs with a legendary counterculture Berkeley professor and a Welsh Californian weed farmer round the back of the uni buildings like school kids, but because of the eye-opening experience of realizing how huge and deep the psychedelic culture had become and how many amazingly clever people there were involved in clarifying and broadening and legitimizing its relevance. So I am really thrilled to be speaking here. Thank you. I'd like to start by making clear that I'm not an academic like a lot of you. I haven't even got a degree. I have no slides. That wasn't meant to diss anyone who's got any slides. I just don't have any slides. Neither am I an expert on anything, least of all death, despite having been an undertaker for 23 years. And just so we're clear about this, I am not okay with death. It still scares me shitless, both dying and being dead. As Philip Larkin said, the mind blanks at the glare. Just in case you project any Ram Dass vibes on me, it happens. People think that constant exposure to death must somehow spiritually elevate your personality, that you seize each moment, don't sweat the little things, are nicer to people, never kick the cat, live each day like it's your last, everything tastes sweeter, perhaps even have some knowledge about what might happen after you die. I sweat the little things. I waste a lot of time, mainly on Twitter, and I can be a grumpy prick. And I have absolutely no idea at all what happens after we die, except that I'm pretty sure it's okay, even if it's just the comforting absence of not being alive, not being a living, hurting human being anymore. But I am still compelled to do it, just because my life experience, actually, let's call it as it is, adverse childhood events, led me to this vocation. And because I'm unemployable and poor, though I'm open to interesting offers. The one thing I probably am an expert on is self-medication, both good and bad, which is, of course, common to a lot of the world right now, living through these troubling times. But harmful self-medication is particularly prevalent amongst those who work with trauma. It's a real problem, unsurprisingly. But I'm not here to talk about bad self-medication. As Carrie Fisher said at the Oscars, whoops, wrong meeting. But you will be glad to know that I have gone into it in some depth in a memoir I have written called What Remains: Life, Death and the Human Art of Undertaking, available at all good bookstores at this conference, which has led to the townsfolk of the small town in which I work, very near here, to look at me wide-eyed. I became an undertaker in a nanosecond. I never had any inkling this is how I would end up making a living. I have no family background into it, which is the usual route in. I have no qualifications, because you don't need any qualifications to set up as an undertaker in the UK, or funeral director, as most of my colleagues call themselves. The first dead body I touched was the first person I buried. I happened to catch a glimpse of someone on a television program, a man called Nicholas Albury, talking about his mission to disrupt the funeral industry in the same way that the hippie home birth movement had disrupted the orthodoxy of hospital births. It was Nicholas, a legendary countercultural warrior on many fronts, who incidentally was one of the founders of Frestonia, nice segue into the last talk there, who unpicked what you could and couldn't do around a funeral, how legally you didn't need to use a funeral director, that in fact you, the bereaved, were the funeral director. You don't need any specialist training because dead bodies are quite straightforward. They are beyond harm. You can, if you have the nerve, do it all yourself, or in my case, help other people to do it all themselves. Nicholas, now sadly dead, changed my life in a flash. I ordered his book immediately, The Natural Death Handbook, the DIY undertaker's equivalent to the KLF's The Manual, How to Have a Number One Hit the Easy Way, and went straight up the pub and told everyone I was an undertaker. They laughed. They're not laughing now. Mainly because I buried quite a lot of them. I was 29, and due to circumstances which I won't go into here because I don't want to completely give the plot away, but I had done fuck all of any worth with my life up to that point. But I had been through a lot of childhood and early adulthood bereavement, and had either not gone to the funerals because children weren't encouraged at funerals in Scotland in the 70s, even if it was your dad who had died. And the funerals I had been to were unsatisfactory from a religious, ritual, or psychological perspective. So my superpower as a fledgling undertaker was knowing what not to do. And that is a powerful place to start from. I knew that radical participation in the entire process was essential, not just turning up as an audience at a culturally barren ritual. I knew that breaking down the barriers between the undertaker and bereaved was essential, that doing it together, rather than being a gatekeeper or an authority figure, explaining the etiquette of what usually happened, was going to be deeply helpful to those who were going through it. We would do it together. So I read some books, saw a dead body, did some press, and boom, I was in. Now, this intensely immersive approach carried and still carries enormous risk. Breaking down the barriers between the undertaker and the bereaved meant there was a lot of emotional contagion, something most funeral directors do their utmost to keep at arm's length, very understandably as it turns out. Now, I say I'd been doing fuck all, but what I had been doing was a lot of raving. I was living in Cornwall, which had a big free party scene, and my friendship group were deeply immersed in it. I loved it. It wasn't my entire life, but it was a big part of it, and I was very much in it when I started undertaking. It was my culture. It was my tribe. Really early on in my new career, my only career to be honest, my bluff was seriously called. The fourth funeral I did, completely on my own, was for a lovely and well-loved, middle-aged family man who, completely out of the blue, violently took his own life. I'd never experienced anything remotely like this, both in dealing with his body and, more importantly, dealing with his numbly traumatized family. The 2 weeks that it took between his wife engaging my services and the funeral itself were my initiation to this work and cemented my place in it. But it was so heavy, and I was so young. The night of the funeral, still deep in shock myself, a friend had a party. I went. I took MDMA and wept while I danced. I felt all of it at once. My certainty that this was the right path for me, my deep sadness at having been exposed to such trauma and grief, my pride in successfully holding the family through it, and my gratitude for my own fragile life. I cradled my blessings and my horrors in my arms. Using MDMA throughout the first 10 years of my working life helped me to cope with this deep immersion in serious grief. It also undoubtedly helped me to partly heal my childhood wounds, which in turn led me to be able to help people at the darkest part of their lives. I say partly because I'm now 52, and these things have a habit of re-biting your ass as you hit middle age, particularly if you have dug it all up with a memoir. But it helped me cope with the deluge of emotion that goes with being an undertaker who deliberately places themselves in the active furnace of grief. But of course, as we all know, healing is not a single one-off event. It is an endlessly unfolding lifetime of hard work with summits and setbacks. But I cannot and will not deny that MDMA helped me navigate these first few years without the need for what therapists would consider essential professional supervision. I know there are a good deal of incredible professionals here doing some amazing work with trauma and MDMA therapy, and I respect that deeply. But I'm an old school raver, wannabe anarchist, and I believe that dancing all night with your friends on ecstasy in a field can be just as productive in healing hurt as any supervised, guided session in a secure environment. It's risky, it's edgy, but it worked for me. But I also know that it's not an endlessly sustainable way to deal with working with trauma for a long period of time. I was having what I can only describe as a decade-long, financially cushioned, slow-motion nervous breakdown. And the reliable warmth of MDMA was a far easier ride than the sudden, jolting gear changes of acid. But what I learned tripping would serve me well when dealing with families plunged into grief, particularly those who are dealing with an unexpected death. As we all know, acid is a double-edged sword. It's never a day off school. But I pity those who experience grief who haven't tripped. The experience is so similar. The sense of being in a world which is separated from the so-called real world by a rizla skin of difference. The unreality of the everyday coexisting side by side, but trillions of light years away. So when myself and my partner walked into a house filled with a family trapped in their own personal grief bubble, it felt weirdly familiar. I knew who needed a cup of tea, who needed a joke, who needed to be left in the corner for a bit. I knew how to be around them, gently, no sudden emotional movements, no power trips, nothing jagged, nothing weird. Grief is a psychedelic, and you need to trip gently around the tripping. So this is the debt that I owe to acid in my work. the understanding that the firm ground beneath us is an illusion, but a steady hand can reach through the gauzy veil and hold you, reach through the rippling portal, ground you in both worlds simultaneously. Help you to know that you are not really alone in this contradictory world of a personally isolating yet universal experience. This is the heart of what it means to be human, to be in the world but to be temporarily lost to it, to let them know it, we, they are still here and they can return changed but not maimed, still alive to living. So these are the two substances that have informed my work in a positive way, as well as the very culture of Acid House itself. We took a lot from the free-form nature of a rave to reconstruct new and more meaningful funeral rituals. I don't mean we slapped down a couple of bass bins and had it large, although we have done that. I mean more the lack of real hierarchy, the shared responsibility of setting it all up and taking it all down after. The idea that transcendence and meaning doesn't have to come from a religious ideology, that you don't need a spiritual framework bigger than the people who are involved. Early raves were stripped back to basics, so we apply that idea to funerals. Less DJ worship or any kind of worship, more community. Less style, more substance. Now, as we all know, breaking convention is like Asterix's village of indomitable Gauls, surrounded by the Empire of Darkness. So please indulge me in some utopian thinking while I'm behind this delusional stockade, delusional due to the fact that this will go up on YouTube. But here are my two takes on drugs and death. I believe that everyone who works with trauma, therapists, doctors, nurses, ambulance workers, firefighters, undertakers, and yes, the police, would really benefit from meeting in groups, maybe 3 times a year, to take MDMA and talk and dance and let it all hang out. I know this sounds a bit like Hunter Thompson's Manifesto for Sheriff, but I really do believe it would help nip in the bud pre-traumatic stress disorder. It's so not going to happen until we have the revolution, but a man can dream. Police and nurses raving and talking and crying together. Imagine how this might help the enormous emotional burnout that all of us who are at the sharp end of the pandemic are currently experiencing. That's take 1. Take 2 is about drugs and dying. Of course, there is a well-trodden psychedelic path going back to old man Huxley, taking his intravenous hit of acid to see him across the Rainbow Bridge, leading right up to the work being done in the UK and in the US, using psilocybin to reduce, even eliminate pre-death anxiety. And I think this work is brilliant. But not everyone dies fearful. A lot of people die angry. A lot of men die angry. I do their funerals, and I see the path they go on. I know that anger is an aspect of fear, but these men who die angry are doing with good reason. They often die early of cancer and feel justifiably cheated of the last portion of their lives. Some of them die angry because they fucked their lives up. A lot of us do. Particularly if we haven't reached the mythical bit of our fantasy life arc where we magically resolve all of our mistakes. These men, not exclusively men by any means, but mainly men who rage against the dying of the light, are incredibly hard to be around if you are a family member. And no amount of psilocybin is going to ameliorate a lifetime of regrets, mangled family relationships, unresolved arguments, and bad parenting. So this is where MDMA raises its sparkly head again. In my fantasy future, I see a space for MDMA to be part of the huge cornucopia of palliative care drugs used in hospices. Not necessarily by the dying person, mainly because I'm not a doctor and I have no idea how MDMA would react with all the other drugs a patient might be given in the last few weeks or days of life. But if it was medically okay, then for sure. But by the family, in the presence of the dying person. We all know how MDMA works when it comes to emotions. After all, it began its post-Nazi life as a tool for relationship counseling. Shit into gold. I dream of families sitting around the bed of the dying on MDMA in the presence of an exceptionally skilled therapist, saying all of the unsaid hurts in a safely held way, talking through things that have been taboo for all of their shared relationship. I believe, no, I know that this could transform the experience of the end of life, not just for the person dying, but for those left behind who have equal importance, if not more, than the dying person. They are the people who have to live with that death for the rest of their lives. Grief is a grueling path, and if we can put to bed some of the hurts that we inflict on each other as we stumble through life, then it would make it that little bit easier. So that's my tuppence worth. I'm here all week. Try the 5-MeO DMT. Thank you.